Thank you very much. Thank you, President Symbolic. Thank you, Father Steinkirchner Scott, for that very generous and somewhat exaggerated introduction. The Southern writer Flannery O'Connor, who died at age 39 of lupus, was a great fan of Thomas Aquinas. In fact, she used to read the Summa Theologiae in bed in the evenings. She once wrote that sickness before one dies is a great grace, and that illness is more instructive than any long journey one might take. In one letter she wrote, "I have enough energy to write with, and as that is all I have any business doing anyhow, I can, with one eye squinted, take it all as a blessing. What you have to measure out, you come to observe closer, or so I tell myself." But she did not speak lightly of the so-called school of suffering. In another letter 10 years later, she wrote, "I don't much agree with you and your friend the nun about suffering teaching you much about redemption." Whether Aquinas provides our bedtime reading or not, all of us wrestle in some way or another with the question of whether and how suffering relates to the mystery of God. I have focused the question this morning in terms of what remains a pastoral issue for many. Does God will suffering? This question is not one of abstract speculation when we or someone we love is living or dying with cancer or AIDS or lupus or any of the many forms of illness that threaten our well-being, our relationships, and our future. What we believe about whether God wills suffering can provide the deepest source of courage as we face suffering and death. But our theological convictions can also deepen our anguish or sense of abandonment by God. The recent tragic shootings in Tucson, Arizona, which left at least 6 people dead, were compounded by plans by members of a Christian church to picket at the funeral of a 9-year-old girl, Christina Taylor Green, with signs that said that God sent the shooter to call Americans to repent for our sins, specifically citing homosexuality and abortion. Only the quick response of Arizona citizens and lawmakers kept them from following through with their plans. We saw similar reactions on a larger scale after September 11th, when some Christian religious leaders, including some Catholic leaders in this country, were quoted as saying that somehow this was, if not God's punishment, nevertheless, that these suicide missions that killed thousands were in the mystery of God's plan that we just can't understand. Other Christian leaders went even further and claimed that the 9/11 tragedy was God's judgment on a nation that had lost faith. Similarly, last month, or at that time, a month later, when the shuttle Columbia exploded, within minutes of landing, anti-American voices were heard to say this was God's judgment on the U.S. for our government's unjust war on Iraq. Each of these episodes was covered widely by the media and over the internet. The connection between religious worldviews and violence is painfully evident as we witness genocide, suicide bombers, ethnic cleansing, and systematic dehumanization of the other in the name of God and God's will. Or in other cases, so-called natural disasters, droughts, avalanches, hurricanes, earthquakes, floods, are described as acts of God, even by those who suffer from them. Just after a cyclone in Bangladesh, for example, The anguished face of a woman appeared on the front page of USA Today, crying out, "Why is God punishing us?" Although there are many disputes among the interpreters of Thomas Aquinas' thought on almost every question, all of them would agree that God in no way directly wills evil or suffering that results from evil. But Aquinas' distinction that God permits evil, the evil that God does not directly will, has proved a troubling claim for many contemporary theologians. This morning, I'd like to focus on two theologians who draw on Aquinas' thought for many of their most fundamental theological assertions, but who explicitly reject the language of God's will when speaking of suffering, even in the form of God's permissive will. Edward Schillebeeckx was a Flemish Dominican theologian who spent most of his years as theologian and professor in the Netherlands, where he died just over a year ago. Schillebeeckx made radical and global suffering the necessary starting point for his 3 volumes of work on Christology, wrestling with the question of how can Christians proclaim that salvation has been achieved in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus when there's so much evidence in our world to the contrary. United States theologian Elizabeth Johnson, who is a sister of St. Joseph, and was also a former president of the Catholic Theological Society, is presently Distinguished Professor of Theology at Fordham University. She too has placed the suffering of the world, especially the suffering of women and children, and more recently the suffering of non-human creation, at the forefront of her theological work on the mystery of God. In the end, Schillebeeckx and Johnson disagree with each other on an important related question, the question of whether God suffers in God's very being. Schillebeeckx sides with Aquinas in denying that suffering can be brought into the divine nature, insisting that God is pure positivity, while Johnson argues that the cross reveals that God has freely chosen to take on the suffering of her beloved creation in a genuinely mutual relationship. But on the question of this morning's topic, whether suffering can be said to be God's will in any sense, the two are in agreement. They explicitly reject Aquinas' language of God's permissive will. I'd like to explore why this morning, and whether in doing so, they actually preserve the basic insight that Thomas was trying to express better than those who maintain that suffering is in the mystery of God's plan. So as you can see, a subtext this morning is the further question, what does it mean for us to do theology in our day, as Thomas did in his? First, why this question? The question of the relationship of God to suffering is certainly not new in our day. It is one version of the classic problem of evil that has always haunted human beings. In the face of evil and suffering and death, can we talk about life having ultimate meaning? After the Holocaust, the Shoah, concentration camps, Hiroshima, genocides in Rwanda, Burundi, Guatemala, Kosovo, after Cambodia, Vietnam, East Timor, Sierra Leone, in the face of ongoing violence around the globe in our day, with the development of chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons, and with our own country involved at present in a war against terrorism, can we speak of life as having meaning and goodness at the heart of reality? It is not only the evil brought about by humans, moral evil, but also what we call destructive forces in nature itself that further complicates our question. In addition to the natural disasters that disproportionately affect the poor of the world and destroy other forms of life as well, what about the natural evils that cause diseases, like cancer, or the genetic mutations that cause severe mental and physical disabilities? And what of the larger process of the evolution of the cosmos? Can we speak of order and purpose there, or is the universe itself moving toward entropy and chaos? There was an article in Time magazine when the journalist Michael Lemonick reflected on the prediction of an astrophysicist that eventually all the matter in the universe would collapse into black holes. He estimated that by the time the universe is 1 trillion, 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 trillion years old, so we're safe, but it's our descendants we're concerned about here, the black holes themselves will disintegrate into stray particles, which will bind loosely to form individual atoms larger than the size of today's universe. Eventually, even these will decay, leaving a featureless, infinitely large void. And that will be that, unless, of course, whatever inconceivable event that launched the original Big Bang should recur and the ultimate free lunch is served once more, he wrote. One very real philosophical option that always stands as a challenge to the faith of believers is that the nihilists are right. Life is empty, meaningless, absurd. For those who believe that there is an ultimate source and goal of all reality that we name God, the classic dilemma has been phrased this way. Either God is powerless in the face of evil, in which case you have to question whether God exists or what you mean by God, or God chooses not to exercise God's power, in which case you have to question whether God is good and whether reality in the end is gracious, which Aquinas pointed out is still another way of denying God's existence. He phrases the objection this way in the first part of the Summa. But the word God means that he is infinite goodness. If therefore God existed, there would be no evil discoverable. But there is evil in the world, therefore God does not exist. Now, as we'll see, Aquinas did not agree with that objection, but he saw it as a serious one, even in his day. Even for those who can accept that suffering is necessary if creation, the world, human persons are to be truly free, there stands the powerful protest of Ivan in Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov, who voices the objection of many of us to a God who would allow the suffering of even one innocent child for the greater good of human freedom or some larger whole. Dostoevsky wrote, "If all must suffer to pay for the eternal harmony, what have children to do with it? It is beyond all comprehension why they should suffer and why they should pay for the harmony. Too high a price is asked. It's not God that I don't accept Alyosha, only I must respectfully reject him and return the ticket." The question of whether and how God is related to human suffering is at the very heart of theology today, because the extent of innocent suffering is a primary cause of atheism. For us as Christians, it remains the primary cause of the incredibility of our central faith claim, our proclamation that God has defeated death and evil in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. In the face of global suffering in our world, how do we give account of the hope that is within us? On the pastoral level, the question is not necessarily the metaphysical one of whether God exists, nor the theologians' disputes about whether God suffers in the divine nature, or rather in God's human nature, in the person of Jesus. Rather, in the end, theologians agree that in some profound way, God has taken on the suffering of the world in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus and broken its power once for all. So the question becomes far more personal. As one of our sisters said to me, I don't know what to pray for. I don't know whether this cancer is God's will for me, and I should be praying for the grace to surrender to death, or whether I should be fighting it and struggling to live. I don't know what to hope for. Many believers who suffer deeply are convinced that cancer or some serious illness is God's will for them, and they say quite clearly, I couldn't bear it if I didn't think that was true. For them, there's deep consolation, and they draw hope and strength to endure their pain in knowing that God asks nothing that God does not provide the strength to bear. But for others, the deepest level of anguish comes from questioning why God would allow this to happen to them or to someone they love. They often feel guilty and can be judged by others as not having accepted God's will for them or not having come to terms with their illness. The point here for theologians is that we are responsible to consider the pastoral consequences of our theologies, and pastoral realities and questions are real sources of theology. So let's turn to Thomas Aquinas first, and then his contemporary interpreters. Aquinas' insights, as you know, come from his 13th century context and his masterful theological synthesis that used the newly discovered philosophy of Aristotle to help in that theological task of faith seeking understanding. In Aquinas' case, understanding meant intelligibility, seeing things in terms of metaphysical causality and purpose. So Aquinas is not going to give a direct pastoral response to the question of whether it's ever appropriate to speak of suffering as God's will. But some of his distinctions can help us make that judgment ourselves and help us to avoid attributing to God what human beings are responsible for, or what neither may be responsible for. So let me highlight a few key distinctions in Aquinas, especially as they're either appropriated by or disputed by Johnson and Skillebakes. So first, God as the pure act of being. Not the biggest being in the universe, not the first cause in a whole chain of causality, not a being who also exists, but the pure, dynamic act of being that sustains everything in existence. Or as the Bible puts it, in God we live and move and have our being. In Trinitarian terms, God is love, the very dynamic act of relatedness, of self-giving, of overflowing compassion. God is the source and goal of all that is, and everything bears some stamp of the image of God just by existing, and even more of a trace of the divine insofar as we are living beings. In other words, God's will is for life, for happiness, for the fulfillment and blessing of creation. As John's gospel puts it in the words of Jesus, I have come that you might have life and have it in abundance. Johnson, who's a feminist theologian and is critical of Aquinas on a number of points, remarked that she was surprised when she wrote her award-winning book, She Who Is, to discover that philosophically, she still judges Thomas to have the most fruitful understanding of God. And she described it, the mystery, in her own evocative, poetic images. In her words, the idea of God as the pure dynamic act of being means that this expresses inexpressible liveliness, sheer livingness, a going forth, an unimaginable act of communion that issues in everything, sheer, exuberant, relational aliveness, inexhaustible source of new being, ground of hope for the whole created universe. It's thus a code word for God as the source of the whole universe, past, present, and yet to come, and as a power that continuously resists evil. Skillabake's too held firmly to the Thomistic insight that God is pure positivity, utter goodness, the source of all being, the ground of all human hope, and emphasized in particular God is the ground of all future possibility. Thus, the titles of two of his books, God, the Future of Man, or Humankind, and God is New Each Moment. So on this most fundamental point about God and God's relation to the world, the three were in agreement. Secondly, precisely because God is the transcendent source of everything that's not a competing actor on the level of creation, God is totally present to us, or as Aquinas would say, immanent in creation. That very presence of God empowers and sustains at the same time the freedom and autonomy of creation. This is the aspect of creation that Skillabake's calls God's great risk. Johnson tries to express the paradox using an axiom of Karl Rahner to remind us that nearness to God, closeness to God, and genuine human freedom increase not in opposite or inverse proportion, but in direct proportion. The more God draws near, the more radically free and responsible we become. Third, on the highly disputed question of whether God is really related to the world, it's well known Aquinas said no. But as numerous Thomistic scholars have tried to explain, to make that claim is not to deny the previous claim that God is closer to us than we are to ourselves, nor is it to deny the biblical God of the covenant, literally the God with womb love for her creation, who grieves over the loss of her little ones. Rather, in Aquinas' own words, the God of compassion is in the kind of solidarity with us that we know in the love of parents for their children at its best. Aquinas, in his treatise on mercy, speaks of persons so united to us as to be, in some way, something of ourselves, such as children and parents. In those cases, we not only have compassion at the distress of the other, rather, Aquinas says, we suffer as if in our own wounds. Although Aquinas saw that as a clear consequence of the incarnation, he was equally convinced of the importance of stressing that not only the incarnation, but creation itself is a radically free gift of God. It need not have been. For this reason, in his Aristotelian categories, he argued God was not really related to the world, not dependent on the world, didn't need the world for God to exist. Rather, God created the world out of sheer, gratuitous love. Skillabake's agreed with Aquinas on this point, emphasizing that creation is precisely what is other than God. Creation is finite and dependent on God, but finitude and dependence are not in themselves evils. It's simply what it means to be creatures. Johnson emphasizes the other side of that key point of Aquinas that he was trying to preserve, the utter freedom and transcendence of God. God did not create the world out of need, but out of gracious freedom and love. But she reminds us in our 21st century context, or she wrote it actually in the 20th, that this is not how we hear the claim today when we say God is not really related to the world. So in our context, she argues, it would make more sense and we'd retrieve Aquinas better, his insight, to speak of God as freely choosing out of love to be so related to the world that God has become one with all of creation and one with humanity in Jesus Christ. Fourth point of Aquinas, the rejection of the notion of God's suffering is corollary to the rejection of the possibility of change in God. Aristotle's metaphysics led Aquinas to conclude the fullness of being necessarily involves no potential, no need for gaining in perfection or becoming. Change would somehow involve deficiency, movement toward a greater fullness, and neither of those are necessary or possible in God, who is fullness of being. Likewise, any form of suffering would reveal a lack of being and a potential for change. But Johnson calls attention to the presuppositions here, to what's valued as perfections on the one hand and lack on the other. And she makes a point of saying this occurred in a patriarchal and hierarchical social system in which some were meant to rule for the good order of all. In that worldview, any kind of interdependence, need, vulnerability was seen as a lack. If all of reality, she points out, is really fundamentally relational, as not only feminists but Trinitarian theologians in general would propose, would it not be more appropriate to speak of God, the source of all that is, as freely choosing to enter into mutual relationship with God's creatures, and to recognize that the sufferings of the world do indeed become God's own suffering? Most Thomists would insist Aquinas did affirm that very point, and the quote I read earlier gives evidence of that we suffer as if in our own wounds. But he did it in terms that preserve more clearly, they would say, the distinction of the two natures in God, natures of God in the incarnation. The human nature of Jesus is the human nature of the second person of the Trinity. God does suffer, but not in the divine nature. But contemporary theologians in here, not only Johnson and Skillebakes, but I'll cite Walter Casper, now Cardinal of the Church, remind us that, again, we have to attend how do modern hearers hear these distinctions. And he argued that Aquinas' careful metaphysical distinction about God not really being related to the world nevertheless moves us to think in terms of a solitary, narcissistic being who suffers from his own completeness. That's Walter Casper. Or Norris Clark, who was a great Jesuit philosopher and theologian and a brilliant interpreter of Aquinas, finally concluded himself the Thomistic metaphysical doctrine that there's no real relation in God to the world should be dropped. Not denied, perhaps, he said, but quietly shelved as being no longer illuminating. Finally, the really difficult issue in terms of our question is that of God's power. Aquinas stressed that nothing exists beyond the divine will. Therefore, he concluded that God enables, or at least permits, everything that happens. Both Skillebakes and Johnson agree that no situation is beyond the power of God's absolute saving presence. But when they come to the question of evil and the suffering that results from evil, neither of them was willing to conclude that God permits evil, nor in any sense that it's even the passive will of God. So let's explore first Aquinas' reasoning on the question and why two people who embrace his thought so thoroughly don't accept him on this point. First of all, Aquinas makes the distinction, following Augustine, that evil is an absence of being, the privation of a good that's proper to our nature. For Aquinas, earthquakes and tornadoes and what we call natural disasters, or even in legal terms, acts of God, are part of the balance of nature, not evils in themselves. But he admits that suffering can result from these events, and he calls that suffering physical evil or natural evil that's distinct from the moral evil that's caused by our voluntary human activity. In terms of physical evil, let's say the lion destroying the lamb for its own nourishment, Aquinas observes that the order of nature involves decay, and the good of one part of creation is not necessarily good for other parts of creation. One difficulty for us is we cannot see that greater good which God wills in God's universal providence. This is difficult enough for us to understand in terms of the lion and the lamb, but even more difficult in terms of cells which cause terminal diseases that result in the deaths of those we love. From Aquinas' perspective, God wills the good and flourishing of every part of creation and the good of the whole. But in a finite universe, not all those goods can be realized at once. God wills the good of the weather system or of the virus, but not the loss of well-being or the life that's denied as a result of those created realities. Some who are now writing in the field of ecological theology would go further and challenge our anthropocentric worldview that insists we are the peak of creation and that human life is more intrinsically valuable than other forms of life, and they would question the very basis of our naming this balance of nature as in some form an evil, even a natural evil. Johnson wrestled with exactly this question in her Madaleva lecture, Women, Earth, and Creator Spirit. She clearly urges that we see ourselves as part of a larger, interdependent creation, all of which is beloved of God. But she also cautions against a simplistic approach to ecological theology that fails to recognize violence in creation. In her comments, she's in fundamental agreement with Aquinas that God is the creator spirit, the great creative matrix that grounds and sustains the cosmos as reverent, empowering love. But she remains more reserved than Aquinas in her statement about why God permits evil. She draws on her earlier conviction that God freely chooses to be in relation to the world. She draws on biblical relational metaphors rather than Aquinas' metaphysical language, as she wrestles with the question of how the Spirit of God operates in and through the created world, even through the randomness and chance of the evolutionary development of the universe. And when she comes to the question of whether and why God wills or even permits suffering in the universe, she admits she has no philosophical answer. She ultimately wagers that it has to do with the freedom that divine love bestows on creation. But at the same time, she reminds us of what Skillebakes calls the absolute saving presence of the Creator God. Turning to the biblical witness of the God who promised to be with us always, she writes, "This does not exclude enormous amounts of violence, entropy, and suffering that exist in the cosmos. Stars are born and die. Species appear and disappear due to natural catastrophe. Individuals know debilitating pain. We may well wonder how love could be empowering such a messy and at times tragic arrangement, made more so by the advent of conscious human beings with our propensity to sin." And then she writes, "I have thought about this problem all my life, and I have read what many wise minds have said, and the bottom line is nobody knows. What can be ventured is it has something to do with the nature of love. Love grants autonomy to the beloved and respects this, all the while participating in the joy and pain of the other's destiny. It vigorously cares and works for and urges the beloved toward his or her own well-being, but but it never forces. Still Johnson here. In an open-ended evolutionary universe, death often becomes the matrix for the birth of the new, the earth from an exploding star, mushrooms from a rotting tree trunk, a new community from the cross of Jesus. At other times, there's not an obvious productive outcome. There's simply that disastrous surd of evil. In either case, the love who is Creator Spirit participates in the world's destiny. She can be grieved. She can even be quenched. When creation groans in labor pains, and we do too, the Spirit is groaning, and the midwifing that breathes rhythmically along is groaning in the midwifing that breathes rhythmically along and cooperates in the birth. In other words, in the midst of the agony and delight of the world, the Creator Spirit has the character of compassion. Neither Aquinas nor Johnson wants to speak of cosmic evil as beyond the presence and power of God, but there's a fundamental difference in the way the two understand the theological task here. For Aquinas, all theology is ultimately for salvation, that we might be drawn more deeply into participation in the divine wisdom and into the very life of God. But the specific theological task is to seek intelligibility, to wrestle with the mysteries of faith and ultimately with the mystery of God. Johnson and Skillibates don't disagree on that point, but they and other political and liberation theologians argue that the truth of the gospel cannot be fully discovered in intellectual terms, in terms of intelligibility. Rather, seeking truth involves doing the truth. It involves the life of discipleship and ongoing reflections on pastoral struggles. Thus, Johnson's interpretation of God's role in the universe is consciously intended to move us to act on behalf of suffering creatures, especially the most vulnerable. Although Thomas would want to argue otherwise, Johnson and others see Aquinas' explanation of the balance of nature as legitimating the status quo, the way things are, and therefore undercutting our action for change, for instance, to protect vulnerable species. What about Aquinas' turn to moral evil? All of that related to his category of natural or physical evil. In terms of moral evil, Aquinas is again clear God is not the cause of evil, even though God is the ultimate cause of all action or being. In his distinctions, God is the cause of the agent, so that Hitler existed, right? And only God enables the possibility of acting, the possibility that Hitler had any power to act at all. But the defect of the human will, the free choice to do harm and not to choose the good, is what Aquinas called the original initiative of finitude. In other words, it's solely human choice. God empowers the acting, but God does not will or cause the defect in our wills. Aquinas' language of God permitting but not willing evil was his way of stating that God's power enables the universe and human beings to be and to be free. Skillibates made the same point in more concrete language, with his language that creation was God's great risk. And as one of my students told me once, he said, and I don't think it was a very good plan. And he said, I hope you're not going to take offense at this. He said, but if God has all this power and we are in such a mess to send one guy and leave it to the rest of us, I don't think it was a good plan. And then he says, maybe it's because I'm a business major. I don't know, but I don't. All right. Skillibates makes the point about God's great risk, that God created human beings and free will so that we could freely choose the good. But God will not force us or program us to do so, nor will God step in when it's a matter of human responsibility. In trusting creation, he says, God has given us a blank check. And as Tim pointed out, I don't think it was a very good plan. Although Skilobates is firmly rooted in Thomas's theology of creation and clearly argues that human beings, not God, are responsible for introducing moral evil into the world and for its devastating effects, Skilobates parts way with Aquinas on the issue of God permitting evil. As we've seen, that notion was necessary for Aquinas if his other claims about God, about divine causality, about divine power, were to be coherent and consistent. In other words, if his theology was going to remain intelligible, he needed that notion, Aquinas. But Skilobates thinks Aquinas paid too high a price for his systematic consistency, or at least that we would, if we were to repeat his conclusions in our context. Skilobates moved from himself being a dogmatic theologian who began with what the church taught in a specific case, or what Thomas taught in this case, to saying we need to begin with people's experience. We need to begin with people's questions. It was the vast suffering in human history that led Skilobates to state that he had broken with his Thomistic heritage. When you take seriously the devastating dimensions of evil that we have witnessed in our day, Skilobates argues, you can no longer speak of God willing suffering or in any sense permitting that evil. We can no longer do that if we are to believe, he says, in a God who is compassion. Thomas could write about some suffering having spiritual rewards or being part of God's inscrutable ways, or the virtue of the person who by their suffering reflects the glory of God, or some suffering happens for a good purpose, which God knows, but remains mysterious to us. And Skilobates recognizes all of that. He says, however, is that the primary context of suffering that we need to reflect on in our day? Or is it rather the kind of radical and senseless suffering that dehumanizes and destroys, what Simone Weil called affliction? It's the kind of suffering that went on in concentration camps, the kind of suffering that occurs when children are abused, the violence of rape, the cruelty of mass murders and tortures, the devastation of the environment. None of this, Skilobates says, can be in any sense called God's will or legitimated in God's name. Like Johnson, Skilobates is convinced that an ethical concern has to be at the forefront of all of our theologizing. One of the criteria of the truth of our theological claims needs to be, does this theology move us to act on behalf of the well-being of humankind and of all of God's beloved creation? As a result, Skilobates said in his Jesus book that he gives up on any systematic explanation of reality as a whole that would propose to offer a rationale or reason for evil. In that book and the whole of his Christological project, Skilobates states that Christians, like all other human beings, have no explanation for evil or suffering. So like Johnson, he's given up on the intellectual question. What we do have, however, he says, is God's response to suffering in a person, in the story of Jesus' life and death and resurrection. When you begin with the life and death of Jesus, Skilobates insists, you never find an appeal to evil as God's will. Jesus never tells someone that it was in the mystery of God's plan that they were suffering. He was always active on behalf of life and healing and reconciliation and human flourishing. Skilobates sums up God's will for humanity in the phrase from St. Irenaeus, the glory of God is humanity fully alive. Or in his own phrase, God's cause is the human cause. And he later said, the cause of all creation. What we discover in Jesus is a compassionate God bent toward humanity. Jesus came to bring life and bring it in its fullness. But human sinfulness and injustice rejected God's offer in Jesus. Human beings, including religious and political leaders of his time, put Jesus to death. Far from claiming that the cross was God's will for Jesus or for us, Skilabakes argues, in one sense, you could say we're even saved despite the cross, not because of it. He refuses to offer any Christian legitimation for injustice or the suffering of the innocent. Further, while he does not go so far as some contemporary theologians in saying that the Father actually abandoned Jesus, Skilabakes does talk about God's silence and apparent absence at the time of the death of Jesus. But he says Jesus died with a radical trust in the one he called Abba. He died clinging to God even when it seemed that God was absent. So Skilabakes takes very seriously Jesus' own agony in the face of death and his anguished words, my God, why have you abandoned me?" At the same time, in telling the story of Jesus, Skilabakes reminds us Jesus' death was not the end of the story. God's will for Jesus and for us is finally and definitively revealed in the resurrection of Jesus. There, God is shown finally to be a God of life, the one who can and does bring life out of death, the one who has taken on the power of sin and death and defeated it once for all. Only if that was true and remains true in our experience do Christians have a word of hope to speak in a world of radical suffering. From the perspective of resurrection faith, we can say that no suffering is beyond the absolute saving presence of God, and that God never deserts us in our suffering. Thus, Skilabakes goes back to his statement of how we're saved despite the death of Jesus and says, but in another sense, we can see Jesus filled an experience that was in itself meaningless and absurd. He filled it with love and meaning, with hope and solidarity with all who suffer. The power of love that enabled him to remain faithful to Abba and to his mission, even unto death, is what was salvific in the death of Jesus. And on that point, ultimately, Aquinas is fully in agreement too. It's the love and obedience of Jesus in the cross that's the saving dimension of the death of Jesus. Although we don't have time to go into Aquinas' theology of the passion and death of Jesus as salvific, he did ultimately agree on that point, as I've just mentioned. The cross reveals not that God wills suffering, but that out of love, God has taken on human suffering precisely to break its power with the greater power of love. For all of their differences, Aquinas and his contemporary dialogue partners agree in the end that what the cross of Jesus reveals is not that God wills suffering, but that God enters into solidarity with us in our suffering and wills that we do the same for one another. And there's nothing we go through in this life that's beyond the absolute saving presence of God. Another Dominican and Thomistic theologian, Christopher Kiesling, has pointed out that that is precisely what Aquinas' language of God's permissive will was originally intended to say. Chris was a colleague of mine at Aquinas Institute in my early years there, and a mentor and friend of some of your own faculty. And he was facing terminal cancer himself at the time that he wrote a very powerful essay on the cancer patient's vision of faith. He stated clearly in that article in America Magazine that he was convinced that cancer and the suffering it entails and the death that it can bring are evil. They are not, he said, they were not God's will for him, and he would fight against them with every medical, emotional, and spiritual resource that he could. At the same time, he realized that at some point in his struggle, he would be called to lay down his life in a profound letting go, a deep surrender into the hands of God shrouded in mystery. Writing from that context, Chris remarked, "God's permissive will does not explain anything. It simply affirms that evil is not beyond the reach of God, of God's knowledge or power or mercy." In our day, in both the pastoral and the political arenas, that language of God's permissive will, or Chris's explanation, I would say, of God's permissive will, like the language of Johnson and Skillebakes, who reject that language, is far more faithful to Aquinas' theological vision than the theories of God's will that often get promoted in his name. Thank you. Thank you very much.